Hello all. Today's lecture is going to be on viruses, and unbeknownst to you, this is the second time I'm giving this lecture because the first time my app that records everything completely messed up. So hopefully this will be an even more awesome, enlightening, and entertaining lecture than the previous one. So let's just jump into viruses, and a few things that you need to know about viruses or keep in mind as we continue through the lecture is, first of all, that viruses are not considered living cells. They need to infect living host cells in order to replicate. And one of the reasons that is because viruses depend on host metabolism. They don't make their own ATP, they don't make their own enzymes, they don't make their own cellular materials. They depend on host metabolism for those things. Viruses always have small genomes, especially when compared with, well, let's just say they always have small genomes. And the genetic material of a virus doesn't have to be DNA. It can be DNA, but viral genomes can also be RNA, and the genomes can be single-stranded or double-stranded. Viruses always have a protein coat, and this is called a capsid, and it protects the viral genome. Viruses also can have an envelope, but not all viruses have envelopes. Envelopes aren't necessary. And finally, viruses infect all forms of living cells. So there are viruses that infect bacteria, there are viruses that infect plants, there are viruses that infect fungi, and of course there are viruses that infect us. So even though we tend to think about viruses primarily infecting human hosts, there are all sorts of other viruses that infect all different types of life. Even though viral life cycles can differ depending on the genetic material and the virus type, there are 6 commonalities to the virus life cycle that all viruses perform. And the first one is that it must attach to the host cell, and it must get the genome into the host cell. The genome has to replicate, viral proteins have to be made, the capsid, remember the capsid is the coat that forms around the genome and protects it, the capsid must be assembled, and progeny viruses must be released from the host cell. And we'll now go into some of the specifics of the viral life cycle. So, and actually, before we go into some of the specifics, there are a few things that I want to clarify. And one of them is that they can differ in their lifestyle pretty substantially. In this example right here, you have a virus entering a cell or an organism without a cell wall. So this mechanism of entry works really well for eukaryotic cells. Well, not all eukaryotic cells. It works well for human cells and for cells that don't have cell walls. You can see here that the virus with an envelope, this particular example, the virus has an envelope, it attaches to the membrane, and then the viral particle, the genetic material inside the capsid, gets inside the cell, and the process can start. This process doesn't work very well in organisms with a cell wall. So over on the right-hand side of the slide, I have an example of how a virus that infects an organism with a cell wall can get its genome into the host cell. In this particular example, this is the classic form of a bacteriophage. And when you're talking about viruses that infect bacteria, those are generally called phage. So if you hear the phrase phage, it's just a virus that infects bacteria. And this is the typical bacteriophage. You can see in the kind of orangish part right here is the capsid, and in the purple is the genetic material of the virus. It also has other proteins that enable it to form this kind of cool docking mechanism where it can sit down on the cell and it can inject its DNA or genetic material into the cell. And these guys don't have an envelope. And finally, before we move on, this is an example of the HIV virus, which looks a little bit more like the example right here. And the HIV virus has an envelope, and it also has a capsid, which you can see right here, and there are envelope proteins. So viruses can take many different forms. Now, we're going to talk in detail about the life cycle of a particular type of virus. And this particular virus is the papillomavirus. So the type of papillomavirus that you're probably all familiar with is HPV, or the human papillomavirus. And HPV is a double-stranded DNA virus, so their DNA is somewhat similar to ours. It's double-stranded. And